The air in the terminal was stale, tasting of floor polish, jet fuel, and the collective exhaustion of 1,000 different journeys ending or beginning. For Chloe, it felt only like an ending. The last bus had pulled away from the curb an hour ago, its red taillights shrinking into the wet, black asphalt like a final, fading hope. Her flight from Portland, a frantic escape funded by the last $74 to her name, had been rerouted to this anonymous eastern city due to a storm system that had no regard for the meticulously planned desperation of a 21-year-old. Now she was stranded.
Her phone was dead.
Her parents, a 3-hour bus ride away, had no idea. She leaned her head back against the cold, unyielding glass of the terminal window, the dark green fabric of her backpack a pathetic pillow. The tattered gray wool of her sweater, a relic from a life that had evaporated 2 days ago, did little to ward off the chill that seeped not just from the window, but from deep within her bones. Every person who hurried past had a destination, a purpose. They were ghosts in a hurry. She was just a ghost. Her gaze drifted across the cavernous, echoing space, landing on a man who was the absolute antithesis of the chaos surrounding him. He stood near a gate, flanked by 2 other men in dark, severe suits, but he was the center of gravity. He was stillness personified. While everyone else rushed, he simply existed, a point of absolute calm in a churning sea. He wore a suit so black it seemed to drink the artificial light of the terminal, tailored with a precision that spoke of a world she couldn't even imagine. And he looked lost. Not in the frantic, map-checking way of a tourist, but in a deeper, more profound sense. His eyes, dark and unreadable from this distance, scanned the faces in the crowd with a weary detachment, as if searching for something he knew he would never find. It was a projection, she knew, a foolish, romantic notion born from fatigue and loneliness. But in that moment, she felt a kinship with his stillness, with the solitary island he had made of himself. Before she could talk herself out of it, before the last dregs of common sense could scream a warning, her body was moving. She pushed herself up, her joints aching from the cold floor, and walked towards him, a small, frayed thing moving toward an unnerving monolith of a man. The 2 men with him stiffened as she approached, their hands making subtle, practiced movements inside their jackets. She ignored them. Her focus was entirely on him. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the threads of silver at his temples, the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. He didn't look at her, not at first. He was still watching the crowd. "Are you lost too?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them, quiet and raspy. They sounded absurd, even to her own ears. A girl who looked like she'd been sleeping in a bus station asking a man who looked like he owned the airport if he was lost. The man's gaze finally shifted, dropping from the chaotic panorama of the terminal to her face. His eyes were not just dark, they were deep, ancient, holding a chilling lack of surprise. He took in her worn jeans, the hole in the elbow of her sweater, the desperate hope she was trying to hide. He didn't speak for a long moment. The air crackled with the silent disapproval of his companions. One of them took a half-step forward, but the man stopped him with a glance so infinitesimal it was barely a movement at all. Then he spoke. His voice was low, a gravelly baritone with an accent she couldn't place, each word delivered with deliberate, unnerving precision. He did not answer her question. He did not ask what she wanted. He simply said, "You should not speak to strangers, it wasn't advice." It was a statement of fact, a warning delivered with the flat certainty of a man who knew exactly what kind of dangers lurked in the world. It was the kind of thing a predator might say to its prey, a final, perfunctory courtesy before the inevitable. And it made her freeze. Not with fear, not entirely. It was the cold, unvarnished truth of it that held her in place.
He was right.
She was being reckless, foolish. But exhaustion had burned away her layers of self-preservation, leaving only a raw, defiant nerve. A bitter laugh escaped her.
"Yeah, well,
My ex-husband was a stranger once. So was the landlord who changed the locks. At this point, I figure the universe is just rolling dice with me. Why not talk to the guy who looks like he's in the middle of a very serious, very quiet existential crisis?" He blinked. A slow, measured closing and opening of his eyes. It was the only sign that her words had registered at all. She watched a flicker of something unreadable move behind his gaze. Not amusement, not pity, something else entirely. Curiosity, perhaps. The kind of curiosity a scientist might have for a specimen behaving in an unexpected way. She pressed on, the words tumbling out, fueled by a dizzying mix of despair and gallows humor. Look, I'm broke, my phone's dead, and I just missed the last bus to a town you've never heard of. I'm not trying to sell you anything or ask for money. I just saw you standing here, looking like you understood what it felt like to be completely and utterly out of place. I guess I was wrong. She turned to leave, the brief, insane burst of courage already dissolving into a familiar tide of shame and regret. What was she thinking? This man was dangerous. It radiated from him like heat from pavement. He was the kind of stranger her mother had warned her about her entire life. From Min-jun's perspective, the girl was an anomaly, a disruption in a world he curated with brutal efficiency.
He was not lost.
He was waiting for confirmation that his private airspace was clear, a minor delay that was irritating his men far more than it was irritating him. He had spent the last 20 minutes cataloging the mundane desperation of the terminal, the frantic energy of people running from things or toward things. It was all noise. He was a man who trafficked in silence, in the unspoken threat, in the calm calculation before a storm of violence. Then she had appeared, a variable he had not accounted for. He had noticed her earlier, a smudge of gray against the garish terminal colors, huddled by a window. He had dismissed her as part of the scenery, another piece of the city's anonymous suffering. But then she had walked toward him, moving with a strange, tired grace, right through the invisible perimeter of fear his presence naturally created. His men, Hyun and Daeho, were coiled springs, ready to intercept, but he had waved them off with a look. He wanted to see what the anomaly would do. Are you lost too? The question was so naive, so absurdly out of place, that it momentarily broke through his armor of detachment. He saw her, truly saw her then. The exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin, the defiant light in her brown eyes, the tremble in her hands she was trying to still. She was not begging. She was connecting, reaching out from her island of despair to his. His warning, "You should not speak to strangers," was genuine. He was the most dangerous stranger in this entire building, a Korean Mafia boss whose name was spoken in whispers in boardrooms and back alleys from Seoul to New York. He was a man who could make a life like hers disappear with a single phone call. And yet, she laughed. A raw, broken sound that held no joy, only a profound, weary irony. Her words about her ex-husband and the landlord were a confession, a rapid-fire summary of a life gone wrong, delivered with the kind of black humor one earns through suffering. He, a man accustomed to lies, to posturing, to carefully constructed personas, was struck by her brutal honesty. She saw him not as a figure of power, not as a threat, but as a fellow soul adrift, looking like you understood what it felt like to be completely and utterly out of place. She was wrong, and yet she was devastatingly right. In his world of immense power, of fealty and fear, he had never felt more out of place than he did in the quiet moments between acts of violence. She turned to walk away, and an unfamiliar instinct seized him, a protective, possessive urge that had no place in his cold, ordered life. Letting her walk back into the indifferent night felt like a strategic error, a waste. He made a decision. It was impulsive, illogical, and utterly out of character. It was the most dangerous thing he had done all day. Wait. The single word stopped her cold. It was quiet, but it carried an authority that vibrated in the air, a command disguised as a request. Chloe turned back slowly. The man, Min-jun, though she did not know his name yet, was watching her with that same unnerving stillness. His dark eyes held hers, and for the first time, she felt a sliver of genuine fear. Not because he seemed angry, but because he seemed entirely too calm. This was a man who did not make suggestions. He gave orders. "Where are you going?" he asked. The question was simple, direct. "A town called Northwood. It's about 3 hours from here. My parents live there. You have no money and no way to contact them," he stated. It wasn't a question. He was summarizing the data she had given him. "That about covers it," she said, her voice tight. She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive posture that felt utterly useless against his penetrating gaze. What did he want? He looked from her to his man, Hyun, and said something in Korean, his tone low and decisive. Hyun's expression remained impassive, but his eyes widened almost imperceptibly before he gave a slight, formal bow and walked away, pulling out his phone. Minjun's attention returned to her. I am flying to a private airfield 40 minutes from Northwood, he said. The statement hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implication. Chloe's mind raced, trying to process it. A private airfield. Private. As in, a private jet. She stared at him, at the impossible perfection of his suit, the quiet confidence that clung to him like cologne, and the pieces began to click into a terrifying picture. This wasn't just a rich man. This was something else. I can offer you a ride, he continued, his voice even.
And a job.
The word was so jarring, so out of place, that she almost laughed again. A job? What kind of job? My assistant had a family emergency. I require a temporary replacement for 1 week. Someone who is a native English speaker to handle correspondence and scheduling. The work is simple. The pay is $10,000. For 1 week. The number was so astronomical it felt like a joke. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was enough to get a new apartment, a used car, to start over completely. It was also, without a doubt, a lie. There was no job. This was a transaction. He was buying what? Her time? Her company? Something more? Her internal alarm bells were screaming. This is how girls disappeared. This is the story they told on the news, the cautionary tale whispered among friends. You don't get on a private jet with a powerful, mysterious stranger. Except her reality was just as terrifying in its own way. A night spent on the floor of an airport terminal, vulnerable to a different, more common kind of predator. The slow, grinding despair of having absolutely nothing. Why me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. You are available, he said, as if it were the simplest, most logical reason in the world. And you are not afraid to ask questions, Hyun returned then, his presence a silent announcement. He murmured something in Korean to Minjun, who gave a curt nod. He looked back at Chloe. My plane is ready. You have 60 seconds to decide. He wasn't pressuring her. He was merely stating a fact. His world moved on a precise schedule, and it would not wait for her. She looked at his face, searching for a sign, a tell, anything to give her a clue as to his true intentions. But his expression was a perfect mask of neutrality. He was offering her a choice between a clear, immediate danger and a slow, certain decay. She thought of her ex-husband's smug face as he'd put her suitcase on the porch. She thought of the cold indifference of the world. She took a breath. Okay. The transition from the public terminal to the private aviation wing was like stepping through a portal into another dimension. The noise, the crowds, the stale air, it all fell away, replaced by hushed carpets, sleek leather furniture, and the quiet hum of immense wealth. Chloe felt her own worn-out presence as a stain on the pristine environment. Her scuffed boots were deafeningly loud on the polished floors. She followed Minjun and his 2 silent guards, Hyun and Daeho, feeling like a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. She clutched the straps of her dark green backpack, the only thing in this world that was truly hers, as if it could anchor her. On the tarmac, the jet was waiting. It was not large, but it was impossibly sleek and white, gleaming under the harsh airport lights like a pearl. As she stepped onto the stairs, a wave of dizziness washed over her. This was real.
She was doing this.
Inside, the cabin was a study in understated luxury. Cream leather seats, dark polished wood, muted gold accents. It smelled of leather and something else, a clean, subtle scent that she instinctively knew was his. Minjun gestured to a seat, and she sank into the soft leather, her worn jeans a stark contrast to the opulence. He sat opposite her, the space between them feeling both vast and claustrophobically intimate. The 2 guards settled into seats near the front of the cabin, their vigilance never wavering. The jet took off with a smooth, powerful surge that pressed her back into her seat. Through the small window, the lights of the city sprawled out and then shrank, becoming a glittering carpet of diamonds scattered on black velvet. They were above it all now, Above the mess, the noise, the struggle. Up here, the world seemed clean and simple. Minjun had not spoken a word since they boarded. He was looking through some papers from a leather briefcase, his focus absolute. Chloe watched him, the way his long fingers moved over the documents, the intense concentration in his dark eyes. He was a man completely at ease in this environment of power and control. She, on the other hand, felt like she was vibrating with a nervous energy that had nowhere to go. To distract herself, she asked a question, the first thing that came to mind. "Do you like flying?" He looked up from his papers, his gaze sharp, as if her voice had physically touched him. He seemed genuinely thrown by the question, as if no one had ever asked him something so simple, so human. He considered it for a moment, his mask of control slipping just enough for her to see a flicker of something else beneath. "I do not like the destination," he said, his voice quiet in the hum of the engines. "Or the reason for the journey. But I enjoy this." The in-between, Chloe understood that completely. The in-between was a pause button. A place where you were neither here nor there, where the problems you were leaving were behind you, and the ones you were flying toward had not yet arrived. It was a moment of grace. "Yeah," she said softly. "Me too." He put his papers down. For the rest of the short flight, he just watched her. He didn't speak, and neither did she. But in the shared silence, something shifted. The dynamic of powerful man and desperate girl began to blur at the edges. She was no longer just an anomaly or a piece of data to be analyzed. And he was no longer just a terrifying, monolithic stranger. He was a man who understood the relief of the in-between. She was beginning to realize she was in far more danger than she had ever imagined, and it had nothing to do with being kidnapped. The real danger was the growing, terrifying curiosity she felt about the Mafia boss sitting across from her. The mansion wasn't a home. It was a statement. Perched on a hill overlooking a distant city, it was a fortress of glass, steel, and dark gray stone. It was brutally modern, all clean lines and sharp angles, designed to be admired, not lived in. As the black car pulled up the long, gated driveway, Chloe felt a new wave of intimidation. The airport had been one thing. This was his territory. Inside, the feeling of cold, sterile beauty intensified. The ceilings were impossibly high, the furniture was sparse and architectural, and the silence was absolute. A woman in a severe black dress, a housekeeper, appeared and bowed slightly to Minjun before her eyes flickered to Chloe, her expression carefully neutral but unable to completely hide her surprise. Minjun spoke to her in Korean, and the housekeeper nodded, then turned to Chloe. "This way, miss." She was led up a floating staircase to a guest suite that was larger than the entire apartment she had shared with her ex-husband. A wall of glass offered a panoramic view of the city lights. The bed was a vast expanse of white linens, and the adjoining bathroom was a temple of marble and chrome. It was beautiful, luxurious, and completely devoid of personality. It felt like a five-star hotel room, a transient space. She put her backpack down on a luggage stand, and the worn green canvas looked almost obscene against the pristine white walls. The housekeeper explained that meals would be brought to her room unless she was summoned. Her work would begin in the morning. Then she was left alone in the gilded cage. The silence was deafening. Chloe walked to the window and pressed her hand against the cool glass. The city below was a galaxy of distant, impersonal lights. She felt a profound sense of isolation, a loneliness that was sharper and more terrifying than what she'd felt at the airport. At least there, she had been among people. Here she was a specimen under glass. She took out her borrowed charger. One of Minjun's men had silently handed it to her on the plane and plugged in her phone. It buzzed to life, and a string of frantic messages from her mother appeared. "Chloe, where are you? Call me. Are you okay?" She dialed, her heart pounding with the weight of the lies she was about to tell. "Mom?
Hey.
I'm so sorry my phone died. Oh, thank God. We were so worried. Did you get the bus ticket I sent?" "Yeah, about that," Chloe began, her throat dry. "The flight got rerouted. I'm in a hotel. A really nice one. The airline put us all up for the night. I'll get the first bus in the morning." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She was a terrible liar. But what was the alternative? Mom. I met a mysterious, possibly criminal, billionaire at the airport, and now I'm living in his fortress of solitude for a week for $10,000. Oh, well, as long as you're safe, her mother said, relief flooding her voice. Just be careful, sweetie. I will, Mom. I love you. She hung up and sank onto the edge of the enormous bed, the lie echoing in the silent room. She was not safe. She was in the house of a man who commanded fear with a glance, a man whose quietness was more menacing than any threat. She was beginning to hear the unspoken truths of this place in the deferential fear of the staff, in the cold, empty spaces. The whispers she'd imagined in her head were starting to take shape. This was not a businessman. He was a mafia boss. And she had willingly, foolishly, walked right into the heart of his kingdom. Minjun sat in his office, a room that was even more severe and minimalist than the rest of the house. The only warmth came from the glow of a dozen security monitors that displayed silent, high-definition feeds from every corner of his property. He was not watching the perimeter or the gate. His eyes were fixed on the single screen that showed the interior of the guest suite. He watched as Chloe paced the room. He saw her press her hand to the window, a small, lonely gesture. He watched her make the phone call, saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she chewed on her lower lip. He could not hear the words, but he knew she was lying. He knew she was creating a story to protect someone, and that act of protection, even a deceptive one, resonated with him. His entire life was a carefully constructed lie designed to protect the violent truth of his enterprise. Hyun entered the office without knocking, his privilege as Minjun's most trusted advisor. He placed a tablet on the desk. Background is complete, Hyun said, his voice a low rumble. Chloe Johnson, 21, student at Portland Community College, studying graphic design before she dropped out. Married 6 months ago to a man named Marcus Thorne. He filed for divorce 2 weeks ago, and the eviction was processed 3 days ago. Parents are in Northwood. No criminal record.
No connections.
She is exactly what she appears to be. A girl with bad luck. Minjun didn't look at the tablet. He continued to watch the screen. He saw Chloe curl up on the massive bed, looking small and lost. And in less than 12 hours, this woman with tired eyes and a reckless mouth had become the single greatest weakness he had ever known. He watched her on the screen as she finally drifted to sleep, one arm clutching her worn green backpack as if it were a life raft. He had brought her here under the pretense of a job, a sterile transaction. But that was a lie he told himself. The truth was far more dangerous. He had brought her here because, for the first time in decades, he had felt a flicker of something other than duty or rage or weariness. He had felt curiosity. He wanted to see what she would do. He wanted to know if the defiance in her eyes was a fluke of exhaustion or a fundamental part of her character. He was the head of the Korean Mafia, a veritable king in the underworld, and he was mesmerized by a broke art student who had nothing to her name but a backpack and a backbone of steel. Hyun was right. She was a complication. But Minjun was beginning to suspect she was a complication he was unwilling to part with. The next few days passed in a strange, surreal rhythm. Chloe's job was, as she had suspected, a complete fiction. She spent a few hours each morning in Minjun's dark office, sorting through English-language art auction catalogs and organizing newspaper clippings about corporate mergers. It was busy work, a transparent excuse to justify her presence. Minjun was rarely there. He would appear for an hour, sit at his desk, and work in a silence so profound that she could hear her own heartbeat. He never spoke about his real business, the business that sent men with hard eyes and holsters under their jackets coming and going at all hours. He was the powerful Korean mafia boss, a phantom moving through the corridors of his own life. But in those quiet hours, a fragile routine formed. She would make coffee, and after the first day of his polite refusal, he started accepting a cup, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, electric moment as he took the mug. She learned he took it black. She learned he had a small, almost invisible scar above his left eyebrow. She learned that when he was truly focused, he would rub his thumb over his lower lip. They were small, human details that chipped away at the terrifying monolith she had met at the airport. One evening, she found him in the library, a room she hadn't known existed. He was standing before a shelf, not reading, just looking at the spines of the books. "I didn't know you read," she said, her voice soft in the cavernous space. He turned, his expression unreadable. These belong to my father. He believed a man could understand the world through books. He was a professor. The information was so startling, so at odds with the man she was coming to know, that she couldn't speak for a moment. A professor's son. And what do you believe? She finally asked. He looked back at the books. I believe my father was a romantic. The world is not understood. It is conquered. Or it conquers you. The bleakness of his worldview settled over her, a familiar chill. This was the man from the airport. The dangerous stranger. But then the crisis came. It happened on the 5th day. She was in the kitchen, trying to coax a smile out of the perpetually stoic housekeeper, when the sound of shattering glass echoed from the front of the house, followed by a barrage of muffled pops. Gunshots. The housekeeper screamed and dropped a bowl, which shattered on the tile floor. Before Chloe could even process what was happening, Hyun was there, his face a mask of cold fury. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. Stay with me. Do not make a sound. He started pulling her toward a back corridor, but the house, once a silent fortress, was now filled with the sounds of violence, shouting in Korean, the splintering of wood, more gunshots, closer this time. They rounded a corner and came face to face with 2 men dressed in black, holding guns. They were not Minjun's men. Hyun shoved Chloe behind him, drawing his own weapon in a single fluid motion. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch and distort. And then Minjun was there. He appeared from a hallway, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt stained with blood at the shoulder. He held a gun with a practiced ease that made Chloe's stomach clench. His eyes were not the calm, calculating eyes she knew. They were blazing with a feral, terrifying rage she had never seen. But when his gaze landed on her, cowering behind Hyun, the rage morphed into something else.
Pure un diluted panic.
In that moment, he ignored the armed intruders. He ignored his own safety. He moved, crossing the space between them in 3 long strides, and threw his body in front of hers, shielding her completely. He was a wall of muscle and fury, and his only concern in a world exploding with violence was the terrified woman behind him. The professional pretense, the sterile arrangement, it all burned away in that instant, leaving only a raw, terrifying truth. The violence ended as quickly as it began. It was a symphony of brutal efficiency, orchestrated by Minjun and his men. The aftermath was a jarring silence, punctuated only by the distant wail of sirens that would never arrive. The 2 intruders lay still on the polished floor. Hyun was speaking urgently into a radio, his voice low and guttural. Chloe stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall, the smell of cordite sharp in her nostrils. Minjun's white shirt was now splattered with blood that wasn't all his. He turned to her, his chest rising and falling heavily. The feral rage was gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear that was directed entirely at her. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing her jawline as if to confirm she was real, that she was unharmed. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice rough. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. Her gaze dropped to the crimson stains spreading on his shoulder. You are, she whispered. For the first time since she'd met him, his control was utterly shattered. The powerful, untouchable Mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man who was bleeding, a man whose eyes were filled with a terror that had nothing to do with his own safety. He had shielded her. He had been willing to take a bullet for her. The thought was so overwhelming it made her knees weak. Later, after the bodies had been removed and the broken glass swept away with a quiet, chilling proficiency, he found her in the library. She was sitting in a leather armchair, wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. He carried a small medical kit. He knelt in front of her, his movements stiff from his wounded shoulder, which was now bandaged. He took her hand. She flinched when she saw a small scratch on her forearm, a thin red line from a shard of flying glass she hadn't even felt. With painstaking gentleness, he cleaned the tiny wound, his touch surprisingly soft. The silence in the room was thick with everything that had happened, with everything that had been revealed. You should have let Hyun take me away, she said, her voice a hollow echo. He didn't look up from his task. I could not. The words were simple, but they held the weight of a profound confession. He finished dabbing the cut with antiseptic and looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. The mask was gone. All of it. "You need to leave," he said, his voice strained. "I will give you the money, more than I promised. I will ensure you are safe, that you can start a new life anywhere you want. But you cannot stay here. You see now what this world is." He was offering her an escape. He was trying to push her away, to save her from himself. He was the Mafia boss, admitting the truth of his life. "I am not a good man, Chloe," he whispered, and the vulnerability in his voice was devastating. "I am a violent man. This house, this life, it is a cage. And it is dangerous." He expected her to be afraid. He expected her to recoil from the truth, from the blood she had seen. But the terror she had felt during the attack had been eclipsed by a different, sharper fear. The fear of him being hurt. The fear of him sending her away. "What if I'm not afraid of the cage?" she asked, her voice trembling but clear. "What if I'm more afraid of you not being in it with me?" His breath hitched. He stared at her, his expression one of utter disbelief. He, Minjun, a man who commanded fear, had just met the one person in the world who was not afraid of his darkness, but of his absence. Weeks passed. The mansion, once a cold and sterile fortress, began to change in subtle ways. A pot of wildflowers, bought by Chloe on a supervised trip into town, sat on a table in the entryway, a small, defiant splash of color. The scent of her shampoo sometimes lingered in the hallways. The silence was still present, but it was no longer empty. It was a comfortable silence, filled with the presence of two people learning to navigate a shared space. The attack had changed everything. The pretense was gone, leaving behind a raw and complicated intimacy. Minjun's business did not stop. The men with hard eyes still came and went. The violence of his world was a constant, humming presence just beyond the walls. But inside, he was different. He was softer, his watchfulness over her now tinged with an open affection he no longer tried to hide. He would find her sketching by the window and stand behind her for long moments, just watching her hand move across the paper. She, in turn, no longer saw him as a monolith of danger. She saw the weariness in his eyes at the end of a long night, the flicker of a smile when she made a dry joke, the surprising gentleness in his hands. He was still a Korean mafia boss. He was still a dangerous man, but he was also just Minjun, a man who liked his coffee black and who had a professor for a father. One evening, he found her on the terrace, looking out at the city lights. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar warmth in the cool night air. "I spoke with Hyun today," he said, his voice quiet. "He has finalized the arrangements." Chloe's heart clenched. The arrangements. The new life he had promised her. The escape. She had been foolish to think he had forgotten, to hope that her staying had changed his mind. She turned to face him, schooling her features into a neutral mask, mirroring the one he used to wear so well. "An apartment?" she asked, her voice brittle. "A bank account? A new identity?" "All of that," he confirmed, his gaze intense. "A plane ticket to anywhere in the world you wish to go. A life free from all of this. It is what you deserve." A chance to be safe. He was offering her the world. A clean slate. Everything a sane person should want. But her world had shrunk and rearranged itself to fit inside the walls of this glass fortress, to fit around the shape of this complicated, broken man. Leaving felt less like an escape, and more like an exile. "There is another option," he said, his voice dropping lower. He took a step closer, and the space between them crackled. "You could stay. Not as my employee. Not as my guest." He paused, and she saw in his eyes a vulnerability that dwarfed what she'd seen after the attack. This was the true risk. "Stay as my wife." The word hung in the air. Wife. It was not a romantic proposal whispered on bended knee. It was a stark choice, a contract offered by a man who dealt in absolutes. He was not offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her a throne beside his, a throne that came with a crown of thorns. "Chloe," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he could no longer contain. "My world will never be safe. It will always be violent. I can protect you. I can shield you, but I cannot change what I am. All I can offer you is my loyalty, my protection. All of me, the mafia boss, the man." Can you love them both? She looked into his eyes, into the depths of the man who had seen the worst of the world, and the man who found peace in the quiet moments in between. She saw the monster and the man, and she realized, with a stunning, terrifying clarity, that she could not separate them. Nor did she want to. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was the surest, most real thing she had ever felt. "Yes," she whispered. "I can."